Dr. Richard Carrier. Got a question from one of my Patreon members, David Salome Abona. If I'm saying that correct, my friend. Thank you for your support being in Patreon. Question for Dr. Carrier and any other mythicist interviewed. It's difficult to explain mythicism to lay people because mythicism doesn't provide a chronology for the origin of Christianity, an alternative to the official Christian version. Dr. Carrier, as any good scholar, says, we don't know because there is not enough evidence to know what happened before Paul. What would be a plausible chronology for the origin and development of Christianity up to Paul or Mark's gospel? Is it okay to speculate?
I mean, yes, as long as you know that that's what's happening, right? Speculation is fine as long as you don't start treating it like a premise, like it's something that someone has asserted is true. So we're talking about what's possible. There are many scenarios that are possible, right, that would fit the evidence perfectly well. And I actually go into this a little bit in my book, Jesus from Outer Space. I have a whole chapter on how Christianity transitioned from the original version to the euhemerized version, the version where they're arguing that there was an actual earthly Jesus walking around Galilee. And I talk about possible timelines and things in there. Quite simply, if you talk the thesis that I develop in On the Historicity of Jesus, which is the one peer-reviewed mythicist theory, alternative explanation for the origins of Christianity, I don't give dates, but I have like a timeline in chapter 12 of that. There's a section where I go through the evidence and the course of events. The only question to fill in would be the actual dates at which things happened, but that's what we can't do because we don't have specific information. So what do we have? We have Paul writing about 50s AD, talking about events that have occurred, that he claims to have occurred 20 years earlier. And then about 20 years after that, we have the Gospel of Mark, and then all other Gospels spin off of that. In fact, they're all built off top of Mark. So there is no independent Gospel tradition that we know of. Now, by the time you get to Mark, I think Mark is a one-off. I think he's the first one to actually do this, to actually create a myth involving Jesus in Galilee. He's made the decision to put Jesus in Galilee. He's made the decision to have Nazareth his home base. He's made the decision to have Capernaum one of his main areas of working, and so on. So I think Mark did all of this. I don't see any evidence of there being anyone doing this before him. Now this is where Dennis MacDonald would disagree. He thinks there's another community that has done this with before Mark. And then he would link that back to a historical Jesus. But I don't think there's a queue. So there being no queue, Mark is our first that we know of. And I think the evidence suggests that there isn't one, because if you look at Paul, you don't see any gospel stuff going on in there, anything that ties to the historical narrative that Mark has created. And if you look at First Clement, which I think was written in between them, so after Paul died, but before the Jewish War, and therefore before the Gospel of Mark, and also cover on the Historicity of Jesus why 1 Corinthians has to be put there. It doesn't make any sense coming later. 1 Corinthians also lacks any knowledge of anything that's in Mark, so anything that's distinctively historical about Mark. So I think Mark is the first time this happens, and then all subsequent histories of Jesus are just riffs off of Mark. They're just rewrites of Mark, expansions on Mark, etc. So that puts the origin of that piece of Christianity in the 70s AD, roughly, certainly no earlier. And that's already 40 years. That's an average human lifetime back then, from when the religion would have begun. And so let's go back to the beginning. What do I think happened in the beginning? I think in the beginning, you have Peter, the person we call Peter, Kephas in Aramaic, is already a significant figure in some sect. Something similar to the Dead Sea sect. We don't know exactly. We can't link exactly what sect, whether it's Essene or some sort of radical fringe version of Phariseeism or whatever. But there's already a sect, I think, going on, and they're already an apocalyptic sect. They're already doing the kinds of things that we see at Qumran. In fact, they might even be a spin-off of the Qumran sect. Not really sure. And so there's already a quorum of 12, just like there was at Qumran. So at Qumran, we know there was a quorum of 12. They already had this group of people representing, probably the intention is to represent the leaders of the new tribes of Israel and after the apocalypse and stuff. So there's the same kind of apocalyptic thinking, and reconstituting the 12 tribes of Israel is a part of the logic of their creating councils of 12. So I think that already existed. And I think they're already doing what's happening at the Dead Sea, where they're rating the scriptures for secret hidden messages from God for when the apocalypse is going to come. And they're trying to calculate when it's going to happen, how it's going to proceed, and so on. So we have all these peshers, these sort of commentaries that are trying to figure out the secret messages in scripture. And it's very clear that Christianity was built out of one of these. It's definitely a pesher-based religion. They found all these disparate passages in scripture, stitched them all together, and that was the revealed, amazing new thing. So at some point, this sect, and it would be the 30s AD, at some point in the 30s AD, for whatever reason, could have been mathematical calculations, it could have been just spontaneous inspiration, Cephas had a vision, or claimed to have had a vision of the Christ, instructing him, the time is now, it's happened. And it said, hey, here, just as you've been seeing in the scriptures, everything you predicted, it's happened. And in this case, in the mythicist scenario, of course, it would be, yes, I have actually assumed a body. It would be like the Philippians hymn, right? I've actually assumed a body. I tricked Satan and his demons into killing me, and that has actually removed all the sin of the world. So, and now God has resurrected me, and so we've begun the end of the end times. I'm the first fruits of the general resurrection. The resurrection has begun. The end is nigh. And this is the vision that Cephas had or claimed to have. And then he convinced the Quorum of 12 to have or claim to have the same vision, confirming his thing. And so this became their new outbreak apocalyptic cult. And it's an anti-temple cult, it's a countercultural cult. So they're very much saying, we have a new and better message, and the end is nigh, so you better get on board with us, or you're going to be damned with all the other corrupt Jerusalemites and Jerusalem leaders and stuff. So it definitely fits in context of the kind of apocalyptic anti-temple countercultural stuff that was going on. And so that movement started, and it was originally a Jewish movement. You've got to be Torah observant, you got to be Jewish. They weren't really thinking, if insofar as Gentiles were involved at all, they were converts to Judaism. So that meant circumcision, following the dietary laws and everything, becoming a full Jew. And then Paul comes along, and Paul never gets into detail as to what he meant by persecuting the church, other than that they didn't like it. So he was doing something. We don't really know. He might have been going around arguing. He might have been going around trying to get them arrested or for something. There was nothing inherently illegal that he could get them arrested for. So he must have been trumping up specious charges, or if that's what he was even doing. He might have just been going and criticizing and trying to be a rabble-rouser. But for whatever reason, he was a Pharisee who was against this sect and trying to argue against this sect and defeat it. And at some point in the late 30s, he had his own revelation, just like Cephas did, that convinced him he was wrong all along, that he'd been persecuting, he'd been on the wrong side of this. And I can even give you the psychology of Paul at this moment. And again, I want to reiterate, this is speculation. This is one of 100 different scenarios that could have happened. But so I'm not saying I know that this is true, but this is just one thing that could have happened. Is I think Paul started to realize that the moral, social message of the Christians was better for Judaism and better for the world than traditional Phariseeism. I think he realized that Phariseeism is kind of a doomed way of thinking. It's going to lead with tension with Rome. It's going to lead with violence and war, and that's going to be bad. Whereas the Christian movement had an opportunity to unite the Gentiles and the Jews in a common, peaceful way of thinking, and that would actually have a more moral message for organizing society. There's an economic message in there. There's a political message in there. By deciding yourselves to create your own more perfect society without having to militarily overthrow anything. And so I think he saw this as extremely politically and economically important. And he may have, Machiavellianly saw it that way, or he may have genuinely thought that this was, therefore, it had to be a message of God, because if it is right, it must come from God. So that it must have convinced him that he was wrong all along. And that might have led him to pretend to have a revelation that converted him, to sort of explain, because that's how you would get into a position of authority, is claim that Jesus appeared to you and elected you.
Joseph Smith.
Right. You would have to claim this back then. But it could also have been subconscious. He might have genuinely had one of these experiences. And I go into, in element 15 in chapter 4 of On the Historicity of Jesus, I list all the psychology and science we have of all the different ways this could genuinely happen. And we know a lot about schizotypal personalities. We know a lot about sleep deprivation-based, ritual chanting, and how that can lead to altered states of consciousness and so on. There's lots of ways that this could genuinely have happened to Paul based on his subconscious reasoning churning up a vision that he needed to convince him to go forward. But there's also the Joseph Smith model, where he could just claim that because he believed in the social moral message. The only way you could get people to sign on with it is to get them to believe the soteriological, theological message, and that required you to claim to have genuinely met Jesus and so on. So whichever way you think it happened, either one looks the same. So that's why we can't tell the difference in the evidence that we have. And so then that's when he starts coming up with the idea that, no, Gentiles don't have to convert to Judaism. They can be saved just by staying Gentiles and just following a certain simpler set of rules and getting baptized and joining the community. And so he's trying to unify the two worlds. This created a little bit of tension with the original apostles, but he is eventually able to convince them that his idea is a good one. And once again, I think there might have been a little Machiavellian thinking here on both sides, because Paul constantly refers in his letters to collecting cash from his different churches and bringing it back to the quote-unquote saints in Jerusalem. So there's cash flowing in. He's showing up with bags of cash and saying, hey, I've got a good idea. So, give me endorsement and I'll keep bringing you bags of cash. He doesn't explicitly say that, but you can read between the lines. It looks like that's what's going on. So that's one possible scenario of what's happening. And so they decide to let him in. And so they say, okay, yeah, you do the, as Paul says, I'll be the missionary to the Gentiles, you be the missionary to the Jews, and then we'll have this unified church.
Stamp of approval.
Right, exactly. And so that still created tensions and problems and so on, but they were on board with it. It's very clear that the central church, the original group, allowed this to happen and basically gave their seal of approval, essentially, rather than condemning him as anathema, which is important because he himself talks about condemning other Christians as anathema, preaching other Jesuses. So there were already cults that are being cut off and saying, no, we're not giving you a status of authority. But he got it for whatever maneuvering he did to get it. And there's some signs, I think, of what he did. But now this has an economic, sociological effect, because there are way more Gentiles than Jews. There were already tons of Gentiles who were interested in converting to Judaism. We know there's a lot of interest in inflow doing that, but there was a lot of resistance to going a full convert because cutting off a piece of your penis is a bit prohibitive, and the dietary laws are really restrictive, and so that was sort of a wall that limited how many Gentiles actually converted. But now Paul took all the hardships away, so now you can get all the things that you like at a much cheaper price, basically, socially and everything. So what's going to happen? His church is going to explode, while the market for the Jewish Christianity is already tapped out, right? Like there's nowhere for it to go, and so his church grew enormously larger over time than the Jewish Christian church. And the Jewish Christian church did just fade out and die away. It was a tiny dwindling sect by at least the 4th century. And it's not even clear that they even still existed by the 5th century. Unless they did, and that's what evolved into Islam. That's a whole other story. Islam looks like an evolution of this original Torah-observant Christianity. But so anyway, that's the situation when Mark is coming along. And so you still have communities that are combined. You have Jews and Gentiles together, Christian communities. Some are getting more and more angry and isolated from each other. And the war is a big problem because the war now creates a huge antipathy between Jews and Gentiles. So the Jews are now a lot less popular than they used to be. And so you have Mark come along and explain. He has to explain two things. He has to explain why the Jews and Gentiles can still get along, but he also has to explain why God allowed the temple to be destroyed and didn't end the world, right? Because they were predicting that the armies would come and there'd be an Armageddon kind of thing, there'd be a battle, but the end was supposed to come after that, right? So the Jewish war happens, the temple is destroyed, and then nothing happened. So this is the problem that Mark has to explain. And so his gospel is kind of a way of explaining that and a way of packaging their ideas to market it to more people and to do it in a way that allows the Jews and Gentiles to accept each other and understand and move on. And basically he's saying, we don't need the temple cult anymore, therefore we don't need the Torah observance so much anymore. But we can still follow the true God, the Jewish God and so on, and based on the scriptures and all of this, and still realize the community that we wanted to realize, the moral and social message. And then you have the more pro-Jewish side doesn't like this. So Matthew writes his gospel, which is he's basically rewriting Mark, adding a bunch of stuff, and in such a way that I suspect that the authors of Matthew were intending people were actually marketing this as the original gospel and trying to claim that Mark is the pretender, the cheap copycat. We don't have explicit evidence of this, so remember, we're in the speculation mode here. So I suspect that's the case, but I can't prove it. But anyway, regardless, Matthew is arguing with Mark. Matthew is saying, no, you have to be a Torah-observant Jew. Only Torah-observant Jews can come in. Even if you're a Gentile, Gentiles can come in, but they have to convert. Not one jot or tittle of the law is not going to be taken away until the end of the world. And then you have Luke comes along and he wants to like fix this tension. So he's still pro-Gentile, but he wants to like smooth things over a bit and also smooth things over with Rome. So Luke's very concerned with making Christianity attractive and popular and acceptable to Roman audiences. And then John comes along and he hates everything Luke did, and he writes his own, position paper on it. He rewrites the gospel to sell his own particular document, his own particular perspective. And each of these documents represents a community, right? There's a community behind these authors that they're trying to fight for against the others. Anyway, that's the development of the Gospels, and that gets us up to just before the middle of the 2nd century. And that's when we have all these diverse sects competing with each other, and then people are starting to assemble New Testaments. They're starting to assemble the early versions of canonical lists.
We need to mend these disparate groups into one and let all their documents be
at the
one,
same
right?
time, choose who not to let in, right? Let's choose who we're going to cut off and declare anathema, and who we're going to like meld into one unit, right? So that they're all doing this. So this is all going on. So anyway, that's the timeline I think we're looking at. So we're looking at, originally it's this offshoot, fringe sect that already has a lot of the ideas of Christianity in it. That's the spin-off of the Dead Sea sect, run by Cephas and his quorum of 12. And then he has this vision of the death and resurrection of the Christ that has happened celestially, and that now we know from Revelation that this has happened. And they have this breakout new, Mormonist, like, the end is nigh, let's do this thing now, reform message. And then Paul comes along, fights against it, but then decides he wants to side with it, flips, and then you have the Pauline literature and the Pauline effect. But his church is the one that ends up writing the first gospel a lifetime later, 20 years later, under Mark doing it. And so then you have all these other churches that have evolved through that time. The Jewish War is a big pivotal event that changed the trajectory of everything, changed the arguments that had to be made, and so on. So that's, I think, probably the best I can do as far as timeline of how the origins of Christianity arose up to the middle of the 2nd century. And that's, one possible. I could probably write 4 or 5 different timelines that would fit the evidence, and different causal systems and so on that would fit the evidence. We just can't narrow it down beyond these.
Thank you.